So can you talk about finding structure and pushing yourself to find a filmic structure that is not necessarily the clear story as it happened, and other ways in which you really exploit sort of filmmaking as opposed to just telling the story of your family? Because I think that's very clear in your films.
Well, I mean, there's multiple questions there. I mean, one is when you're filming. Once I made the decision that a film was happening, like with 51 Bird Street, when my father said that, that moment where he said, "No, I don't miss her." I'm not only thinking, oh my God, there's a film here, but suddenly I go from being a son, helping his father leave home, to a director. I mean, instantaneously, and now I'm suddenly thinking in terms of like, okay, what shots do I need? I mean, remember I said a number of things had to be lined up in order for me to do it. The primary thing that had lined up was I had done this family history interview with both my parents. I had 2 hours of interview with my mother, talking about her whole history, and I remember her talking about my father and the marriage. I didn't remember the specifics, but I thought, oh, I could go back and actually, talk about resurrect dead, I could resurrect my mother through those interviews. And you saw in the trailer, we actually shot it off a monitor, played it back and shot her interview through the monitor to give it almost more ghostly effect. And so that was like a big factor in it. But I had 2 weeks. I also knew that the film was going to end. You're suddenly thinking structure. Okay, if I'm making a film, what's the story? I knew intuitively that the story was going to end whenever my father left the house. When the moment they went in the car, the house was packed up and empty. They'll get in the car and they're going to drive up the hill and go off. And that's kind of the ending of the movie. It almost is. There's a slight little postscript, but so right away I'm going like, okay, I got the ending. I'm not going to do any shooting in Florida, out of the house. It's all about the house. Now, I didn't have the title of the film, but I knew the house was going to be like a character in the film. 51 Bird Street, by the way, is the address of the house.
And in fact, the title was the subject of many months of dialogue on the D word,
right,
with everyone giving a suggestion and batting it back and forward, but it's a great title.
Yeah, titles are hard. Actually, the running title of that was Only Human, which is a little too on the nose, and also luckily turned out to be a film that was a fiction film that was in Cannes that year that we were editing. And in fact, when we changed the title to 51 Birch Street, I went back that fall, which was the time period we had shot in, and got 1 million shots of the house from every possible angle. And the people who owned it were starting construction on it, so I had to get like everything that was, like obscured shots of the house with the trees, the turning leaves, the street in front. And we used almost every one of those shots in the film, because we just needed to build that sense of, that tangible sense of place. I was also very lucky. I talked about my relationship with my father changing during the shot of the hands clasp at the end, that's very brief at the end, but sort of hints at how far our relationship came. In the editing, we know then where it's ended in terms of the arc of our relationship. What was the killer was trying to set up the beginning. I mean, it took almost 30 different re-edits of the first 10 minutes of the film to kind of nail it, because there was a lot of exposition. And it was very, very difficult to set my father up as the bad guy, because when you see him in interviews, he comes across as so warm and fuzzy and likable. And I was like, damn, Dad, we tried every little editor's trick to make him look bad, and we couldn't. And the way we did it was, he like I said, mechanical engineer. Remember the old days of mini DV when you had to run off like the first minute of tape to keep dropout from happening? So I was about to interview him and my mother, and I'm running off a minute, and he's like, he sees something in my lens, the way the lens was reflecting or something. Anyway, he's just sort of peering into my lens, but of course I'm on a wide angle, and he looks really ominous, peering straight into the camera. And what we did was we took that, like 5-10 seconds, and I wrote a line of narration that, you know, I've always been close to my mother. There was a photo of me as a young kid adoringly hugging her. I cut to my father peering ominously. My father is a very different story. And then we cut to black and move on. And that unfair setup carried you through the next half hour thinking my father, oh my God, what did he do to you? Did he molest you? Did he, you know, that's what I mean about, like, you have to set your parents up for these sorts of, Dad, you're gonna look a little bad.
Gently ease them into it.
By the way, I have another funny story about that very subject of family and how they deal with all this. I still remember when, I mean, my family, my sisters, my dad, I mean, they all knew that I had made films that had gone into theaters, been on TV. They still, you know, when you're shooting on this little mini DV camera, they still think of it as home movies. I mean, there's a disconnect there. They don't see this as something that's going to ultimately end up in those places. And I remember when we premiered 51 Birch Street at the Toronto Film Festival, and we're walking down the hallway into the theater. As we're just going into the entrance, my oldest sister turns to me and goes, I still don't understand who would possibly want to see this other than the family. You open the door and there's 450 people packed in the theater. I mean, it was, you know, there was actually another DVD extra on 51 Birch Street, this one, 20-minute one, where my family talks about the reaction. And I think it's actually really important, you know, in personal documentaries to have an extra where you give your subjects the power to reply, you know, to comment and to get their feelings out, because they're putting all this faith in you and trust in you to tell their stories truthfully, accurately, and it's all a manipulation and a construct. And the fact that, you know, my family still talks to me, much less still loves me, you know, is like, you know, the highest compliment, I think, that they feel okay with it. But it was particularly important with The Kids Grow Up and dealing with Lucy, who had just a very complicated reaction, which you'll see later, that, you know, she just have that, you know, be given that power.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you talk about it in one of your rules. Just to lead us into your rules, what are your own personal rules for when you need to pull back because you're a human being who is related to these people, and when, despite the fact that you probably want to pull back as a filmmaker, you need to push in?
That question is by far best exemplified with The Kids Grow Up, because dealing with Lucy, you know, being a parent and being a filmmaker was very tricky. And the only way I could really deal with it was being a parent first, you know, and filmmaker second. So parenting trumped filmmaking, which is really hard when it got down to the end of the year, and she was just about in the last week before she went off to college. When, you know, by the way, I'd spent the whole year trying to really pick my spots very judiciously when I was going to film with her, and only do it when she was ready and willing and okay with it. And then August came about. She was getting ready and packing, and everything got really stressful. And about a week before she left, she just had a complete meltdown on camera. And there's a very interesting moment in the film, because, you know, my rule was always, you know, I'd ask Lucy if she was okay with my shooting this, and sometimes she would grumble but say yes, or if she said no, I wouldn't do it. But if she ever told me to turn the camera off or down, I would turn the camera off or down. And sometimes she would be totally fine about my shooting. Sometimes she would tell me after 5 minutes, I'm sick of this, turn it off. And you never quite knew what you were going to get. Or she might change her mind, and something that was okay suddenly doesn't seem like right. You know, it's a lot of feeling out. But that meltdown was one of the two hardest things I ever filmed, because in that moment, I mean, she's just talking about how much she hates doing this, and I'm invading her privacy, and Lucy was always very, very sophisticated about the camera. She always knew when I was rolling, and I always kept, you know, that red light that's on over the lens. I always made it a point to keep that on so that she would know. And so she knew I was still rolling. I mean, I'm sitting there in my mind going like, oh my God, do I turn it off? Do I keep it rolling? What do I do? And, you know, it was almost like a Sophie's Choice moment. Where you're going like,
kind of like a Sophie's Choice.
Yeah, because the filmmaker, the parent in me goes, I know she's just stressed out about packing. It's not real, you know, yes, it's about this, but there's also this whole other thing. And the second she tells me to turn it off, it's off, and I'm like, my arms are around her. But, you know, at that point, the film is your baby too. You know, it's a year of shooting, and you know, I knew I was onto something really powerful. And you know, the way I trick myself into doing these kinds of films is I think about, you know, the impact of this on audiences. You know, I don't sit there going like, oh, this is going to bring me such great glory. I mean, you have to be an idiot to think 51 Birch Street would do that when you were making it. So I sit there going like, wow, wouldn't this be, you know, so many people experience this about their parents. You know, this is going to be a really universal story that people can totally relate to. And what parent can't relate to this? And, you know, hopefully younger people will relate to Lucy going off and dealing with her, you know, annoying parents. And so, you know, it was very tough, but Lucy never told me to turn the camera off in that instant. And I just kind of let it roll.
It's a very powerful moment in film, and not only did you let it roll, but you didn't lose the frame. You didn't like your filmmaker brain was fully engaged, but obviously your heart must have been torn out as a parent.
It was tough. That one took me. I knew she was getting a little bothered by filming, even though I was really trying to pick my spots. But that took me off guard, and so keeping it steady and letting it roll. You also, you know, the other filmmaker part in your head is going, you know what? You make the choice in the edit room. If this seems like totally wrong, I've gone too far, right, it's uncomfortable, what, you know, for all those reasons, you just say, you know, you give yourself as many options as you can. And you know, as a filmmaker, you're always pushing your subjects a little bit, you know. You see how far they're willing to go. The minute they go, no. And by the way, there's another aspect to this, which is Lucy was always the first to see every cut. She, and because I didn't have to raise any money to shoot it, I deliberately waited until she was 18 and came back and looked at some footage to even try and get a release form signed. But I put together about 30 minutes of footage very quickly. But it was some of the toughest scenes in the film, including that one. And I told her, you know, I sat her down on Christmas break. I said, okay, watch this, because, you know, I don't want you to come back later and say you didn't know that this was going to be, and it's going to ruin my life. But I've got to go out and raise a lot of money to finish this. And if you think it's going to really negatively impact your life, tell me now, and I'll shelve it. And I meant it. I mean, I truly meant it, because you can't make a film that your kid just feels that way about. You can't. And luckily, you know, she said, you know, at the end she was quiet for a moment or two, but she just said, you know, I think it'll be a good film, and signed the release form.
God love her. She's a lovely girl. We hoped she could come today, but she was like, Dad, I don't want to come to your thing.
She's got some program stuff. Never